It was back in 2022. I was staying in Oakland at the time, but I'd made the trip up to Eureka to see my parents for the weekend. If you've never taken Highway 101 along the North Coast, it's gorgeous when the sun is up, but it turns into a total nightmare after dark. You're looking at massive stretches of road with zero cell service, no street lights, and not a single other car in sight. It gets eerie fast. I ended up leaving my folks' place around 8:00 p.m. on Sunday. Looking back, that was a huge mistake. I really should have just crashed there and left Monday morning, but I had an early shift and figured I'd just power through the drive. Famous last words. The first couple of hours were fine, but eventually, the road thinned out into 2 lanes, which is standard for the rural parts of the 101 north of the bay. I was somewhere near Trinidad when the fog rolled in. Now, coastal fog is normal, but this was on another level. Within 5 minutes, I went from perfect visibility to barely being able to see 20 feet past my bumper. It was brutal, worse than it sounds. I dropped my speed to about 35 mph and kept crawling. The logical move would have been to pull over, but there aren't many spots to stop there, and I just wanted to be home. I figured slow and steady would get me there, but the thing about fog that thick, and any Californian knows this, is how it destroys your sense of space. Landmarks vanish. You can't gauge distance or see what's coming. It's completely disorienting, especially when you're exhausted. After driving for another 30 minutes, I spotted a figure on the shoulder. I call it a figure, because that's all it was at first. A dark shape about 50 feet ahead. As I drew closer, I realized it was a man, just standing there facing the pavement. He wasn't hitchhiking or looking at a phone. He was just existing there. I slowed down even more as I passed, terrified he might step into my lane, but he didn't move an inch. He didn't even turn his head to watch me pass. I got a decent look at him, and honestly, nothing about his face seemed weird. I figured maybe his car had broken down nearby, but I hadn't passed any stalled vehicles. There was no reason for him to be in that specific spot. I considered turning around to help, but a gut feeling told me something was wrong. I just kept driving. 10 minutes later, I saw him again. I'm not kidding. It was the exact same guy, same build, same dark clothes, same posture. The only difference was he was on the left side of the road now. I actually yelled, "What the hell?" out loud. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. No shortcuts, no other cars. The only logical guess was a twin or a weird coincidence, but I had to be sure. As I passed, I looked again. It was definitely him. This time, his head snapped toward me and he locked eyes with my car. It was terrifying. I sped up to 45 mph, pushing it as much as the fog would allow. I needed distance. But the fog only got thicker until I couldn't even see the yellow lines. I had to slow down again. My brain was scrambled from fatigue and fear. Then 3 minutes later, my headlights hit something in the road. A person was standing right in the center of the lane. I slammed on the brakes. He was wearing a hood now, hiding his face, but I knew it was the same guy. He just stood there, staring at me through the windshield. I flashed my high beams, hoping for a reaction, but he didn't budge. I threw the car into reverse, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart stopped. Someone was behind me, creeping toward my trunk. I screamed, shifted back into drive, and floored it. I swerved into the opposite lane to get around the guy in front. I thought I was clear, but then, bam, something slammed into the back of my car. Hard. The whole rear end jolted, and I heard the sickening crunch of metal. I didn't stop. I sped off, and when I checked the mirrors, there was nothing there. No people, no other cars, just empty fog. By the time I hit the 101 interchange, the air cleared, and I started to breathe again. I actually convinced myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. I'd been driving for hours, staring into a gray abyss. It made sense that my brain snapped. But when I got home and walked to the back of my car, the bumper was totaled. A massive dent stretched across the entire width. No paint transfer, which meant it wasn't a car that hit me. I stared at it for 5 minutes in total silence. I eventually called the cops just to report it, but I knew it wouldn't lead anywhere. I've spent 4 years trying to rationalize it. Maybe I hit a guardrail while panicking, but I can't shake the feeling that something much more malicious was out there in the fog that night. The wooded trails last spring break. This happened just a few weeks ago during spring break. I'm a senior in college now, and I went back to my hometown, which is one of those boring suburban spots where there is absolutely nothing to do. Since none of my friends were in town, I decided to focus on a reset. No drinking, just working out. On a Tuesday afternoon, I went for a run. I picked a 3-mile loop I've done 1,000 times since high school. It starts in my neighborhood, cuts through a small forest trail, and ends back at my house. The woods are usually the best part. Quiet, soft ground, very peaceful. I headed out around 5:00 p.m. The sun was still up, but the fog was incredibly thick. Thick in a way I'd never seen before. It looked like a video game render, where everything past 40 feet just dissolved into gray. I almost stayed home, but I told myself I knew the path well enough to do it blindfolded. I entered the woods, and the fog got even heavier under the trees. I was tracking my pace on my Garmin watch. 1 mile in, everything was fine. 1.5 miles, still normal. But by the time my watch hit 2.5 miles, I realized I was still deep in the forest. Usually, by that point, I should have been hitting the hill that leads back to the street. I figured the GPS was glitching because of the trees. But then my watch hit 3.0 miles, the length of the entire loop, and I was still surrounded by trees on a dirt path that didn't seem to end. I stopped. There are no forks in this trail. There's no way to get lost unless you walk into the brush, which I hadn't done. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps. The fog was even worse now. About 1 mile into my return trip, I heard it. A sound. It wasn't an animal. It was a low, fluctuating drone, like a human trying to imitate a siren. It would swell and dip, swell and dip. It sounded wrong, in a way I can't describe. I started sprinting. I was exhausted, but the fear was pushing me. No matter how fast I went, the sound stayed right behind me. Every time I looked back, there was nothing but fog. Finally, I burst out of the trees and onto the street. I nearly collapsed. I turned back to look at the trailhead, and there it was, a massive, dark silhouette standing in the middle of the path. It had to be 7 feet tall. It wasn't moving, just swaying slightly, watching me. The droning had stopped. I ran the rest of the way home and didn't look back. My parents think it was just a tall creep trying to scare me, but a human can't make that sound while keeping pace with a runner for a mile. I don't know what was in those woods, and I don't think I want to know. Willapa Bay, about 6 years ago, my friend Edwin and I finally went kayaking in Willapa Bay, a massive tidal estuary in Washington. We weren't rookies. We'd been on the water our whole lives. That's important because I don't want you to think we were just two guys getting spooked by some mist. We launched on a Saturday morning near Nakota. The fog was dense, but we had GPS and a compass. The plan was a simple paddle out to Long Island and back. For the first hour, it was peaceful. That muffled, quiet feeling you only get in coastal fog. Around 9:00 a.m., I heard a splash. I thought it was Edwin, but his paddle was resting on his lap. He'd heard it too. We drifted in silence, listening. It was the sound of oars, not paddles. Someone was rowing a boat nearby, maybe 100 feet to our right. We figured it was a fisherman. Edwin called out a "hello," but there was no answer. The rowing didn't stop or change pace. For the next 20 minutes, that rhythmic clack, splash stayed exactly the same distance from us. It was unnerving. At one point, the fog thinned for a second, and I saw it a small wooden rowboat with a figure inside. Then the fog swallowed it again. I told Edwin I wanted to get to shore. We angled southeast, paddling hard. The rowing sound followed us the entire way. Finally, the fog lifted enough to see about 100 yards. I looked to the right. Nothing. Behind us. Nothing. The bay was completely empty. Edwin looked terrified. We hit the shallows, jumped out, and dragged the kayaks onto the sand. As we stood there catching our breath, Edwin noticed something further up the beach. Footprints. Wet, barefoot prints coming out of the water and leading toward the trees. They were fresh. The water was still pooling in the sand. I followed them with my eyes. They came from further down the shore, walked right past our landing spot, and vanished into the woods. I insisted on following the trail backward to see where they started. Edwin was hesitant but didn't want to be left alone. We walked for a few minutes and found it a small, dark wooden rowboat pulled up on the sand. It was the exact boat I'd seen in the fog. Think about the math on that. We were out there for 2 hours, changing directions. For that person to get to shore before us in a slower rowboat, walk down to our exact landing spot, and disappear into the trees before we even stepped onto the sand. It's impossible. I haven't been back to Willapa Bay since.